Today, I'm going to talk about an important factor in the development of the American colonies and subsequently the American identity: religion. Religious beliefs motivated English settlement and shaped colonial thought and traditions throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. But for us to really understand these beliefs and their role in colonization, we must first understand some important background information about religion in Europe during this time period. Religion in Europe had been significantly upheaved in 1517 when Martin Luther posted his protest against the Catholic Church on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral and set off what is known as the Protestant Reformation, which is a major schism that would divide Christianity in Europe. England had remained Catholic up until the 1530s, when King Henry VIII broke away and formed the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. By 1560, Protestant religious views became the dominant faith in England, with most Englishmen and women belonging to the Church of England, the head of which was the king or queen. In this way, the Church of England was not only a religious institution, but it was also a political institution as well. Commitment to the church equaled commitment to the crown. England's Protestant beliefs intensified its rivalry with other European countries that were Catholic, namely Spain and France. This competition with Spain and France is one of the factors that prompted English rulers such as Queen Elizabeth I to get more involved in the New World and move towards colonization in the late 1500s. The earliest settlers at Jamestown brought their religion with them. Most of the settlers in Virginia were Protestants and members of the Church of England. They created established churches in the colonies, and the local government often paid to support those churches, specifically the Anglican Church, with tax money. However, it is important to note that most of the people in the southern colonies did not come to America specifically for religious purposes. Therefore, there tended to be a great deal of religious toleration within the southern and middle colonies. One example of this is the creation of the Acts of Toleration in Maryland. Another example is William Penn's Holy Experiment, which was tolerant of many different religious groups. This, however, was not the case in the northern colonies of New England. So the New England colonies were formed primarily for religious purposes. While England had broken away from the Catholic Church, some believed that the Church of England was still too similar to Catholicism. Calling themselves Puritans, they wanted to rid the Church of England of all Catholic rituals, and they opposed the hierarchy of English bishops who were in power within the Anglican Church. Because opposition to the Church of England also meant opposition to the king, Puritans were viewed by many in the English government as a potential threat, and they were often persecuted. As a result, many Puritans fled from England in search of a place where they could practice their religion more freely. The first group to travel to New England were the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were radical Puritans that were called separatists. In other words, they wanted to break away from the Church of England completely and pursue their own religious beliefs in the New World. They settled in the colony of Plymouth in 1620. A larger group of Puritans arrived in 1630 and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the Pilgrims who came before them, the Puritans who arrived in 1630 did not want to break away from the Church of England. Rather, they wanted to create, as their governor, John Winthrop, called it, a city upon a hill, or a shining example for the proper way to worship God. They were hoping that the religious reforms that they were to implement in New England would spread back to their mother country. The journey of these Puritans in 1630 would set off a larger migration known as the Great Migration to the colonies. Between 1630 and 1642, about 70,000 people would migrate to the Americas, and about 21,000 people would journey to the New England colonies, many in search of religious freedom. The Puritans who arrived in New England created a society based on their religious beliefs. Puritans were Calvinists who believed that God was all-powerful, all good, and all-knowing. Humans were naturally sinful and wicked, but God had chosen some souls, known as the elect, for eternal salvation. This concept was known as predestination. As a result, Puritans were constantly looking for signs around them of God's saving grace. Most early Puritans believed that they were indeed predestined by God for salvation in heaven, and the institutions that they created in New England reflected that belief. For example, government and church membership were heavily intertwined in New England society. The right to vote was extended to all freemen or adult males who were full members of the Congregational Church, which was the official name of the established church in early Puritan communities. Full membership was available to any Puritan who had a conversion experience and could convince the rest of the congregation that they were predestined or saved by God. Because so many Puritans believed that they were one of God's elect, the religious society created by the Puritans was also very, very democratic. Religion also played an important role in the creation of public education. The Puritans believed everyone should be able to read so that they could read the Bible for themselves. As a result, Puritan New England had some of the first grammar schools in the Americas. Likewise, they needed a place to educate the ministers who would serve the growing number of communities in the New England area. Before becoming the premier university of America, Harvard was actually originally formed to educate Puritan ministers. The religious fervor of the New England region meant that they lived in a world in which they were always alert to signs from God or threats from the devil. Solar eclipses, strange coincidences, sudden fires, droughts, livestock diseases could all be signs of God's will or the work of Satan. As a result, witchcraft was very plausible to many of the people who lived in the colonies, and there were actually documented cases of witch trials in many parts of colonial America and even back in England before 1650. Puritan New England, however, was way more anxious about witchcraft than other colonies, and New England prosecuted about 93 witches before 1692. In that year, 1692, there was a significant increase in the fear of witches and the threat of witchcraft. The Salem witch trials created a mass hysteria within Puritan New England that concluded with over 150 accusations of witchcraft and 20 executions. This gruesome event demonstrates the powerful role that religion played in the daily lives of New Englanders and Puritans. The New England colonies, which were founded on religion, became one of the least tolerant areas of the Americas, especially when it came to other religious groups. Puritan leaders saw dissenters or outside religious groups as a potential threat to the mission of the city upon the hill. Thus, people who challenged the authority of ministers were oftentimes banished from the colonies, such as Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Both were exiled and eventually settled in what became the colony of Rhode Island. Over the years, Rhode Island attracted many radicals in New England who did not conform to Puritan beliefs. Not everyone was so lucky, though. On a number of occasions, Puritans executed people for their religious beliefs, including probably most famously Mary Dyer, who was executed for being a Quaker. This intolerance also extended to Native peoples. In general, English settlers often saw Native Americans as pagans whose religious beliefs diverged greatly from their own. However, Puritans took this belief even further. Puritans viewed Native lifestyles as a threat to their city upon the hill and a possible temptation for members of the community. And they directly competed with natives for control of the land and its resources. As a result, the Puritans often made war with native tribes and attempted to drive them from the area. Examples of this include the Pequot War in 1637 and the later King Philip's War in 1675, which resulted in many Native American tribes being driven from the New England region completely. The Puritans did make some attempt to convert Native Americans through the establishment of quote-unquote praying towns. These praying towns attempted to convert tribes of the New England region to Christianity and teach them about English culture. However, overall, the English were way more interested in driving Native Americans off of desirable lands than they were in converting or assimilating them. So ultimately, the religious experiment known as the City Upon a Hill never succeeded. The main reason was that England never paid much attention to the reforms that the Puritans were implementing in America. Over time, as New England became a larger commercial success, more and more people settled in the New England colonies for reasons other than religion, and the importance of Puritanism began to fade. Puritan ministers had to offer a halfway covenant in the 1660s in order to maintain church membership. Despite this decline, the religious society created by the Puritans had an important impact on the establishment of democracy in America with things such as the Mayflower Compact. It promoted education, and it even established values that we consider to be fundamental to America today, including the existence of the Protestant work ethic. Religion had other far-reaching consequences for colonial America, too. New England was not the only area that was becoming less religious over time. In general, the colonies were less religious at the beginning of the 18th century than they were when they were first settled. New liberal ideas were especially challenging the religious beliefs that had been established in America. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that stressed the importance of logic and reason over faith. Such thinking, which prioritized human free will, ran contrary to traditional religious teachings. The rise of the Enlightenment and the decline of religion within the colonies led to a major backlash in the colonies, producing a religious revival in the 1730s and 1740s known as the First Great Awakening. The Great Awakening began in Massachusetts with the preacher Jonathan Edwards, but quickly spread to all parts of the colonies. Preachers such as Edwards and George Whitefield warned of the perils of sin and the horrors of eternal damnation. Preachers of the First Great Awakening would hold large outdoor revivals where attendees, touched by electrifying sermons, would confess their sins and commit to a new restored faith in God. In some ways, the Great Awakening split the religious community. Some religious leaders, known as Old Lights, were skeptical of the emotional sermons and some of the antics of preachers, such as Whitefield, which they dismissed as too theatrical. New Lights, however, applauded the Great Awakening for revitalizing religion in American society. Overall, the First Great Awakening was more unifying for the colonies than divisive. The First Great Awakening was one of the first major shared cultural events in the colonies, and it had the effect of breaking down sectional barriers and beginning the process of creating a unified American culture. The Great Awakening changed the way that people thought as well, for it taught people to read the Bible on their own and think for themselves. This greatly undermined the authority of local ministers and encouraged Americans to question authority, which they would certainly do during the American Revolution many years later. Finally, it paved the way for greater religious toleration. The Great Awakening did not endorse one specific church, and as a result of the Great Awakening, new religious denominations were created, adding to the religious diversity of America prior to the American Revolution. Thus, religion had a huge impact on the development of the American identity prior to the American Revolution, and its influence would not only impact the ideas of the Revolution, but would also be embedded in the first constitutions created by the states and the eventual U.S. Constitution, which proclaimed religious freedom in the First Amendment.